The attack came at dawn, not with banners or declarations, but with precision. A strike meant to end things before they began. The rival factions' forces moved through the palace like shadows, their weapons silent, their intent clear. This was no political maneuver. This was extermination. Ethan was already awake when the first explosion rocked the outer walls. His training kicked him before thought. He moved through the corridors, assessing damage, tracking movements. This wasn't a battle. This was a slaughter. The assassins weren't here for prisoners. They were here to remove Ilvara, erase her claim, and force the kingdom into submission before it could ally with a human. He didn't wait for orders. He acted. Ilvara met him in the war room. Her armor hastily fastened, her expression unreadable. Her guards had already fallen into formation, but there was hesitation in their stance. Their entire lives, they had been told that humans were lesser. Now, one stood among them, giving orders as though he belonged. And he did. The main force is hitting the palace, Ethan said, scanning the map. That's a distraction. She nodded, already catching on. The real strike is coming from the east. Their eyes met. Understanding passed between them. She turned to her guards. With me. The eastern corridors were eerily silent, too silent. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fallen soldier's weapon, its unfamiliar weight barely registering before he fired. The blast caught the nearest assassin mid-step. Then the ambush broke. They came fast, disciplined, but Ethan had seen worse. Fought worse. His movements weren't elegant like Ilvara's. They were efficient, brutal, human. A blade whistled past his ear. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted, and drove the stolen weapon home. Another enemy lunged. Ilvara intercepted, her daggers a blur. They moved together, not as separate fighters, but as something new, complementary. By the time the last body hit the floor, the palace was in flames. The rival faction had underestimated them. They had planned for a warlord, a brute. They hadn't planned for intelligence. The king arrived, his elite guard securing the halls. His gaze swept over the fallen enemies, then to Ethan. You saved my daughter. Ethan wiped blood from his hands. We saved each other. A pause. Then the king laughed, a deep, knowing sound. You were right, he said to Ilvara. Strength is not just muscle. The war wasn't over. The rival faction would return. But the message was clear. She wasn't weak. And she wasn't alone. As the fires died, Ilvara looked at Ethan, truly seeing him for the first time. Perhaps the galaxy had been wrong about humans. The arena was vast, its walls lined with banners from every major faction in the galaxy. The galactic trials weren't just a competition. They were a spectacle, a proving ground where warriors earned their place among the elite. Ethan stood at the center, surrounded by some of the deadliest fighters across the stars. He wasn't the biggest, the fastest, or the strongest, but he was the most dangerous. The first trial was endurance, a relentless gauntlet of shifting terrain, combat drones, and high-speed projectiles designed to push competitors to their limits. The alien warriors powered through with brute force, smashing obstacles, using their biology to their advantage. Ethan, he studied the patterns. Where they rushed forward, he maneuvered. Where they overpowered, he outthought. By the time the trial ended, half the competitors had collapsed. Ethan stood among the few remaining, barely winded. The nobles watching from above muttered among themselves. A human had lasted this long? Impossible. The second trial was combat. One-on-one duels against warriors who had been bred for battle. Ethan faced a hulking reptilian, twice his size, its claws capable of slicing through steel. It came at him like all the others, expecting him to fight on its terms. He didn't. He let it charge, let it swing, let it think he was barely avoiding the blows. Then, in a flash, he moved. A step to the side, A shift in weight, a calculated strike to a joint instead of muscle. The beast staggered. Another blow, this time to the neck, where its armor was weakest. Before it could react, Ethan had it on the ground, a blade pressed against its throat. The fight had lasted seconds. By the time the trials ended, Ethan wasn't just surviving. He was winning. But victory came with consequences. That night, as he returned to his quarters, he sensed a shift before he saw it. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. The faint sound of a blade leaving its sheath. The assassin moved fast. Ethan moved faster. The fight was brutal, silent, efficient. By the time the body hit the ground, Ethan was already scanning the room. The insignia on the attacker's armor was unmistakable. A rival house. A faction that had never wanted this alliance to happen. A message, loud and clear, leave or die. He didn't bother reporting it. Instead, he went straight to Elvira. She was waiting. She already knew. "They won't stop," she said, voice calm but eyes sharp. "They see you as a threat." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Good." A flicker of something crossed her face. Amusement? Respect? She exhaled. "This is bigger than just us now. If you stay, it means war." His response was immediate. "Then we fight." For the first time, she truly believed him. Ethan Drake stepped into the royal chamber, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He wasn't the tallest man in the room. He wasn't the broadest. He wasn't covered in battle scars or armored like the towering warlords that had rejected Elvira. But the moment he entered, the energy shifted. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't here to beg. He was assessing. Elvira sat on her throne, her expression unreadable. He was different. That much was clear. No posturing. No attempts to prove his worth through force. He simply existed in the space as though he belonged, even when every noble in the room whispered otherwise. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "you believe you are fit to stand beside me?" Ethan smiled slightly. "I believe the question is whether you are fit to stand beside me." Murmurs rippled through the court. Arrogance. Insolence. Elvira raised a hand, silencing them. "Explain." Ethan's eyes flickered with amusement. "You've invited creatures from across the galaxy, each bred for war. Each one turned you away because they only saw muscle. If that's all that matters, then they're right. You don't belong among them." He took a slow step forward. "But if your kingdom survives by more than just brute force, then maybe the problem isn't you. Maybe it's them." Her gaze narrowed. "And you? You are different." He tilted his head. "You know I am. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking." She exhaled slowly. He was bold. Not reckless, not overconfident, calculated. He had come prepared, knowing exactly how this conversation would play out. "Interesting." She motioned to the guards. "If you are so sure of yourself, then you will not object to a test." Ethan shrugged. "Wouldn't be here if I did." The chamber shifted, the walls unfolding to reveal a combat arena below. Elvira rose from her throne and descended the steps, stopping in the center of the pit. "You will fight me." The court erupted, some in outrage, others in amusement. A human against their princess? It was a joke. Ethan didn't blink. "Rules." She unsheathed her twin daggers. "No killing. Everything else is permitted." He nodded, rolling his shoulders as he stepped down to meet her. The moment the fight began, she moved first. Fast, precise. She struck at his throat, at his ribs, at the weak points of a warrior. He dodged, not with brute speed, but by reading her. Patterns, rhythm. Then he stepped forward, not attacking, forcing her to react. She adjusted, shifting her stance, testing him. He didn't overpower her. He redirected, controlled, disrupted. And then he disarmed her. In a blink, she found herself on the ground, a dagger skidding across the stone floor. Ethan stood over her, not gloating, not boasting, waiting. For the first time, the court was silent. She stared up at him, breathing hard. No other suitor had fought like this. They had all tried to dominate her, to prove their strength, but he had adapted. Ilvara pushed herself up, wiping dust from her sleeve. You didn't win with strength. Ethan smirked. No, I won with intelligence. The lesson was clear, and for the first time, she considered the possibility that this human might not be a mistake. That night, the royal council convened. The nobles were divided, tradition versus survival. Ilvara listened, but her mind was already made up. She stood, cutting through their arguments. I will grant him a trial, she said, her voice unwavering. If he proves himself in more than combat, he will have his place here. The king's jaw tightened, but he gave a slow nod. Then let him prove it. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw respect, not pity. And just like that, the game had begun. Princess Ilvara sat in silence, her fingers curling into her palm as yet another suitor turned away, shaking his massive head. His voice, thick with disdain, echoed across the grand hall. She is too small, too fragile. A ruler must be strong. The words weren't new. She had heard them from warriors across the galaxy. Some had laughed, others had been more diplomatic, but all had said the same thing. She was unworthy. The court watched in silence, their expressions carefully neutral. Her father, the great King Zalzor, sat on his towering throne, his disappointment unspoken but heavy in the air. The weight of duty pressed against her chest. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about marriage. It was about alliances, about securing the future of her people. Without a strong union, their enemies would see weakness, and weakness meant war. She had trained her whole life, not with brute force, but with tactics, strategy, the mind that could turn tides of battle. Yet none of that mattered, not when every species in the galaxy valued power above all else. As the latest suitor departed, the court murmured. The rejection was expected, yet each one chipped away at the illusion that a solution existed. Then, a voice cut through the tension. If you've run out of options, perhaps it's time to consider a human. The words came from a Terran diplomat, standing among the observers. The reaction was immediate. Laughter, scoffs. A few nobles outright sneered. Humans, one of the counselors spat. What could a human offer? Ilvara's lips pressed into a thin line. She had never met a human in person, only read reports. A young species, unpredictable, physically unimpressive by galactic standards. Yet, something about the suggestion unsettled her more than the ridicule of her own kind. The king's deep voice rumbled through the chamber. We are not so desperate as to turn to primitives. The diplomat only smiled. And yet, your daughter remains unwed. Silence, unspoken truth, was a dangerous thing. The diplomat stepped forward undeterred. I know of a man, a soldier, a leader. He has stood against creatures 3 times his size. He wins not by strength, but by mind, by instinct. Perhaps it is time to measure worth by more than just brute force. Ilvara's father scoffed. And what is his name, this so-called warrior? The diplomat's smile widened. Commander Ethan Drake. The name meant nothing to her, but the way the diplomat said it. It was not a suggestion. It was a challenge. That night, as Ilvara sat in her chambers, she turned the idea over in her mind. A human, her people's pride screamed against it. Yet, if aliens saw her as weak, as lesser, what difference did it make if a human was the one to stand beside her? And so, the summons was sent. 3 days later, he arrived.